Hey there, it's Natalie Topa again. So you want to build an eco-village. Well, there are a lot of different ways to go about this. And eco-villages can take on a lot of different scales, a lot of shapes, a lot of legal and financial approaches. So I want to unpack a little bit some of the varieties of how that's done. When I was doing my urban planning degree, one thing that was really hot at that time was new urbanism. And new urbanism was sort of this collective living conscience movement for urban, particularly urban development. And real estate developers would find an urban infill or revitalization area and within an existing community retrofit into there a new urbanist community. And what that is something that's trying to sort of go back to the days of old, where kids could ride their bike down to the soda shop or to the local grocery store, where neighbors and elderly folks can have a easy walking distance to get to local conveniences and parks. They live in a walkable, livable neighborhood with beautification and nice design. But at the heart of that, there is a community component, and that means that you have smaller homes. Actually, it's sort of, I feel like it was a predecessor to tiny homes. They weren't tiny, but they were quite small. And so in a lot of new urbanist developments, it kind of goes back to the notion that a lot of people want to kind of move away from having these huge lawns on all four sides and having to maintain them, and to try to minimize the amount of effort they're going to have to go into maintaining their space. So new urbanism was really about real estate developers usually creating a new internally focused community which had smaller homes, had vehicle access on the outside, and had all these linkages, pedestrian linkages and community linkages, and then they would sell their individual homes just like in any other real estate sale. So that's one way of going about it. You know, individuals can act as real estate developers. You need to understand all the legal and financial implications of that, but that is one thing that happens. You can also buy a piece of land and build your own home on it, and then with a bunch of friends, they all also build their homes, or you interview people as they may want to come in. So either as an individual or as a group of people, you can buy the land and have a vision of how you want that to be. And let's say if you have 10 plots, but only 3 friends who have bought into that. So now you can embark on that process of identifying people who are like-minded, who have an idea of what you're trying to accomplish there, and who are willing to buy in. Land is not always only for purchase. There are a lot of different creative ways to try to get land: borrow land, rent land, there's land that's inherited. There are arrangements that can be made about maintaining land. So for example, if there's an elderly couple who have a huge piece of land but aren't able to maintain it, but are willing to let you use that for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, there are a lot of different configurations that can be made with sharing that don't always have to mean money. So just wanted to highlight that. When I was doing my master's program, I actually did this was 16 years ago, I did a mini thesis on Danish co-housing, communities. And so what that was is really a group of people who were socially driven to come together based on reducing their ecological footprint and living more sustainably. And what that meant in terms of a physical space is having internally focused communities around a village green or a common space, a common shelter, a common structure, like a dining hall or a community living room, where all the homes are oriented, somehow around that. Vehicles remain around the periphery of the site, and that's because you have children, young children, pets, dogs, and you want them to be free in this open community space to run around without the risks of vehicles and cars. And let's face it, our human habitats and physical spaces have been vehicle dominated for a very, very long time. So great idea to move away from that. Um, so along with the co-housing, also you have a lot of shared services. So in many of the communities that I had studied. So things like laundry are done collectively, childcare, recycling, food production, gardening. So you have shared responsibilities. It's almost like one big family with chores, and everybody is divvied up in terms of what they're supposed to do and how they're supposed to contribute. So that is a pretty cozy and tight relationship. And I say it with a bit of caution, because a lot of efforts to create a village or intentional community face challenges, because at the heart of it are human beings, and humans are imperfect. So that's one thing you really need to be very clear on when you're trying to think about creating a community, is the human governance element and what the expectations are, which I'll get into. So there are different types of communities. As I mentioned, there's the co-housing community style. But then, there are eco-villages and master planned communities that can be huge. The first one that comes to mind is Oroville in India. It is literally a city, and it's got towns within the city, but it's just cluster upon cluster in I don't know the area of land, but it is large. It has neighborhoods within the whole entire village, and it's something that's really interesting to take a look at. There are spiritual centers, so people there are definitely driven by a philosophy, by a systems of ethics and values. So when people buy into that community and decide, yeah, I want to be a part of that, it's understood that they share and have a common alignment with what the vision is philosophically of that place. So, it can even be, kind of going back to the small end of the spectrum, a matter of getting a couple of acres of land with a few people that you know very well, and that you're quite confident that you can get along well with, and just building a space that makes sense for you. And I think that that is a very kind of safe approach to begin with. But definitely check out some of the larger models, because they are very interesting. And right now, where we are just in our world with people trying to refocus on bioregional economics and living within our ecological context, and how that plays out in terms of residential options, it's really going to be interesting to see how practitioners, academicians, economists, thinkers, start to come up with new tests of human governance and how we organize our physical space and how we meet our needs within that. Just take a look at my notes here. So there really are two main elements, obviously, of eco-villages. As I mentioned in my first video, there's the eco and the village. So eco, and really that aligns with the physical elements of village making and the social elements. So in terms of the physical elements, obviously we're taking permaculture principles about space making, about integration of elements, about optimizing sectors, understanding the natural energies that are flowing in and out of a site. So that's sun and wind and slope and gravity and all the different kinds of energy that we have. I'm talking about actual different types of energy. So now, if we overlay that into a village making scenario, we are still looking at zoning, right? What are the spatial relationships between different elements, but big? So big permaculture, not huge not regional, but bigger permaculture. And so what are the relationships to nature, to nature also, but to your neighbors? And you got to think about how cozy do you want to be? How much privacy do you need? Do you want to be full and open and have transparency and everyone can see each other all day long and see what one another is doing? Or do you need to have a bit of boundary and space to maintain some respectful distance and sanity? That's up to you. But zoning applies. So understanding how energy is concentrated within the village. What is zone 0? Is that the heart? Is that the community center and the main community structure? And from that, concentrically, we have our uses on food production and biodiversity and livestock and orchards and all of that. And again, there is a focus in many eco-villages to be internally focused. And what that means is to sort of wrap yourself around a village green or a common space, because it does promote togetherness and a sense of connection. And again, leaving behind some hazardous or noxious uses and elements like vehicles, like dumpsters, like whatever you might want to retain on the periphery of the site, that once you drive in and enter the site is just left at the door, and now you come in and can meander through on a network of bike paths or footpaths. Either they're developed and paved and formal, or informal, sort of trails through the woods or whatever that is. But again, the flow and the energy and the focus and orientation is internal, so that you are, you're within a visual, line of sight of a lot of things that are going on around you in the community. And a lot of that does have to do with the little people, right? And the kids, and this sort of idea that the village is raising the child. And so you want to have surveillance in a good way, just to make sure that people are safe and can be seen and watched over. But that's a design element that you need to think about with your new neighbors and life partners in village. Okay, I did talk about external access and vehicular orientation. So again, I'm not going to talk about that more. So common spaces. Common spaces refers to a few different things. It can be about, again, the green and open spaces, the notion of a village green, a community gathering space, and then also greenhouses and gardens. And that's another element of the management to think about is, all right, what are the expectations? We've got gardens, we've got greenhouses. Do we have collective food production, or do we have individual homes within villages that we each have our own garden, or is it somewhere in between? I grow tomatoes and beans, but together we grow corn and sorghum. These are all the kinds of things to think about in terms of the dynamics, the shared responsibilities, what level of energy does every person have to contribute to this whole system. So it can get quite complex, right? And so a lot to think about. Sorry, I'm just looking at my notes. Oh, I was in Totnes in the UK, not Totnes, in Lyme Regis, on the Jurassic Coast, and I was in a community that was an intentional community, and they didn't produce dairy. They produced dairy on the site, but it was not any of the residents. They actually lent the space, the physical space within their community to an outside person who would maintain the cows and all the dairy and received dairy in exchange for that, and so did the community. So they had an arrangement, and I really encourage people to think about all these creative and maybe non-conventional ways to share resources, to have different arrangements and agreements with service providers. That's sort of what the sharing economy is about, right? In permaculture, we talk about a sharing economy where you have different people with different skills and talents that can provide services and goods in exchange for barter and all these different arrangements. So get creative and think about different ways that you can meet your needs without having to use money or fossil fuels. Okay, so just really quickly on the structure and shared or built space. So another way of lowering costs, which one reason that a lot of people do this is about the cost, right? How do we reduce our expenses, and how do we share some of the inevitable expenses? And so that can be done structurally as well. Common spaces in many communities actually have a very small house and eat every meal together. So every meal, everybody comes together, have a shared dining experience. That may also be where you have arts and crafts and living in laundry, utilities, appliances. Maybe there's a library where you'd come and check out a vacuum cleaner or a blender or tools or farming equipment, but really looking at how within the structural environment you can bring your costs down by sharing all these different elements. But again, you have to be careful and understand who it is that you are signing up to live with and whether or not that's going to work, because I think you have to be really honest about just how the reality plays out and just making sure that the human dynamics are going to work. Because if you're talking about sharing every meal with someone that's not your immediate family, or even just, is it expected that you need to eat every meal together, or is it going to make people feel awkward if you just are having a bad week and want to hang out and eat popcorn and Netflix and chill or whatever. So, again, it kind of goes back to why these communities are developed and sort of how they're philosophically and ethically driven in many cases. And, do your actions as an individual align with what the expectations and the goals are of the group and the community? And how much do you need to contribute your energy to achieve that? So that goes into the social element, obviously. So the social aspect and human governance. There's a lot of interesting research on the scale and numbers around what is sort of the critical mass and scale of people in order to have functional social relationships, economic relationships. I encourage you to check out the Dunbar number. That gets into a lot of statistically, socially, how humans relate to one another, how we're able to recognize and identify each other, and sort of our capacity to even recognize different human faces within a certain period. I think it's the human mind can functionally, effectively recognize 150 people within their immediate environment and know who they are, what their names are, what their roles are, what they do, kind of keep up with them. But beyond that, it's limited. And so when we're talking about these huge eco-villages, some of the models that are based actually on some of the indigenous cultures and how human civilization has organized itself historically, which is actually really interesting because I came to work in South Sudan after, in post-war South Sudan starting in 2005, and in the rural areas where people live in mud huts with thatched roofs and have literally no modern assets, and how they organize themselves, starting from the family, husband, most often multiple wives, the children, how they divide up land, and how there's sort of a community and village, and then in relationship to another one. So they're separate. They come together for events and courtships and gatherings and celebrations and things like that. But they have these, sort of pods, and those pods fit into bigger pods and bigger pods. And so I think there's research around the critical mass and sort of economies of scale as we start to organize ourselves as human beings, what is efficient. So, I think looking at a model where you have no more than 10 homes around a central structure or a community space, like a community center, or a common building, 10 families that are no more than about 150 feet equidistant, each of them, from that sort of the heart of that community, that's sort of the nucleus, and then another 10 families with their nucleus, and then another with their nucleus, and suddenly you're talking about 30 households, 30 families. And that's when you start to actually now have critical mass for much more of a sharing economy and a financial economy that becomes more viable and feasible. So a lot of interesting research around that. I definitely would suggest looking into that. So again, a lot of these communities, a lot of people are compelled by socially driven reasons to be a part of a collective community. Their worldview, their philosophy, religion, Whatever it might be, their value system is like, okay, I want to live with a bunch of people who agree with me on a lot of things on how to live life. Makes a lot of sense. Who doesn't want that? So that is, that can be maybe for purposes of healing or personal growth, or just sort of having sort of peace and tranquility, knowing that you are surrounded by people who are moving in the same direction as you are with your ethics. And that's just a really important thing to think about, because, again, a thing that requires a lot of clarity when you're entering into a relationship. It is a relationship. That you're living with people, you're seeing them in and out, day in and day out, and you need to understand how you relate to them and what their sort of foundational, their philosophical worldview foundation is, and how they and you both contribute to this vision. And so that goes into managing expectations. It is so critical to manage expectations that everybody understands what they're signing up for. Is there an exit strategy? How do we make decisions? Do we make decisions by consensus, or is it majority rule? If you have majority rule, well, then you have a minority that are not ruling, and that can cause conflict, and that can cause hard feelings, and that can be antithetical to the whole worldview thing, and the ethics. There's a lot of studies, and I'll recommend different books and reading on that. But how you go through a facilitative process of either consensus building or just general decision making around major decisions that affect the whole community. And also, what are the repercussions if you don't do that? How do we set rules if we're going to live together for a family? What are the rules? What happens if you don't follow the rules? What recourse do you have? Are we going to hate each other at the end? I'm actually about to start building a new cob house on my friend's farm here in Kenya. She has a 12-acre farm, and she has kids and a husband, and she's great and bold and courageous, and she's also done a couple of cob houses on the same site. But, we both can be intense, and we both can be bold in how we think, and we're both, don't shy away from being creative and trying new things. But I told her, I want us to have a contract. I want us to anticipate everything that we might disagree on. And we need to, foolproof our friendship. And let's think about all the things in the process of the construction, from the design. It's her land, we have different styles. Should that concern either of us? Because, I don't know, She's done this before using the materials and soil of that land. I've done it in other areas. We have different techniques. Are we going to agree? So we're just trying to, anticipate what might get in the way of us just having a successful, a successful experience in building this together. And let's write it out, and let's make a reference so that we can, if things start to get disagreed on, then we can be like, let's refer back to that and govern ourselves. So, yeah, what are the rules? What happens if we break them? And then, the very important thing to remember is that, especially when it comes to legal and financial responsibilities to one another, that, in the beginning, everyone is friends, everyone is great and gets along and has mutual understanding. But when there's a departure from that, you just want to make sure that you've covered your bases. There's a saying in Somali that says, trust in God, but tie your camel. So I'm going to share some resources for you to explore. I hope they're interesting, but I definitely hope that everyone has a little vision, and maybe at one point will be bold enough to go out, get some friends, get some land, build some homes, and have a regenerative little community. Thanks. Good luck.